All right, hey guys, we're just starting the meeting just now. Give a couple of minutes for everybody to come in if they need to. Make sure that this is open for people to come in. So if you're watching the recorded version, you can kind of skip ahead a little bit. Just making sure that we can get people in, that it's open. All right, so it is 7 o'clock, and so I'm going to go ahead and get sort of started here with just the basics. So I've got a few questions here that I'm going to answer for the first Sleep and Dreaming live lecture, and I'm going to order them. I'm going to answer them in the order in which they were asked on Moodle. And I'm just going to give the first name of the person who asked the question. So if we get people who come in, there might be a little slight hiccup. So if you're watching the recorded version, you might see, some things kind of flash, but I'm going to go ahead and get started since we're right at 7 o'clock. Okay, so like I said, welcome to the first live lecture for Sleep and Dreaming. This is where I answer questions that were posted on the forum. The questions are extra credits. You don't have to ask a question. And you can answer other people's questions if you think you know the answer, and you can get some credit that way as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first question that was asked was from Emily. You should be able to see my screen on this page on the screen. You should be able to see the question written out. So I'm going to make that large so you can see that. So Emily asked if there are over thousands of species of different species of fish, why have only less than 10 been studied in a lab for their sleep behavior? And to answer that question, why have only less than 10 been studied in a lab? Well, that's actually a very loaded question. So there's a lot of different reasons. One is simply funding. So we know that, you have to have money from a source to study things, whether it's to the cure for cancer or, something that's very, very simple, like, is there a relationship between not getting enough sleep and, how you feel? So we need money to be able to study these things, and studying animals especially can be difficult because it can be difficult to secure funding for that. And there are so many different kinds of fish and different species of different animals that there's always usually some specific reason why a particular species is chosen. Sometimes it's because the most work has been done on that fish. Other reasons are it's easier to study it because we can make better links to a human, better associations to humans. So, it's not as hard to say this is related to this and then translate that to humans. Fish are harder to translate to humans, obviously, because we're very different in terms of behaviors and things like that. But the good thing about the study of certain species, like for example, the fruit fly or Drosophila, that it's a much simpler species, so we've been able to actually map the genome, and then we can start knocking out different genes and looking at different things. So you can look at different sleep cycles and circadian cycles in fruit flies, and because they're a simpler species, we can actually make more associations and sorts of things with those species. So the short answer to your question is why haven't a lot of them been studied is mostly because it's funding issues. It's also interest. There are certain species that are harder to get. There are certain species that are harder to study. And the ones that have been studied, like tilapia, for example, zebrafish, are very popular in their circadian field. They're more heavily studied. And when you study one particular species and try to learn everything about it, it gets easier to make associations because you can say like, oh, we know so much about this particular animal or species or fish or whatever, and then you can start making these associations. And for your second part, if only less than 10 have been studied, the information we know about fish sleeping habits is not very accurate for fish in general, and you're absolutely 100% correct. When we only study one special thing, if we only study one particular area, one particular species, one particular thing, it really does limit our ability to make any sort of generalization across fish. The same thing happens in humans. If we only study women, it's harder to make generalizations across men and women. If we only study children, it's harder to generalize across all children or adults and children, which is why we see a lot of issues with medication. Medications have been notoriously studied in the pharmaceutical world in men, a lot of times in white men. So can we generalize that to African American men? Can we generalize that to women, Hispanic women, for example? And so whenever you do a very limited sort of study on something, it is hard to make generalizations. So you're absolutely right. We don't know a lot about sleeping habits for fish in general. We only know of the species that we've studied, sort of immensely studied those few amounts of fish. We only know that much about those particular fish. So you wouldn't be able to generalize that across all, especially if a fish, for example, doesn't have eyes or is, a very, very, very deep sea fish. You can't compare that to a freshwater fish. You can't compare that to, a fish in a lake, for example, or a catfish. So yes, it's a very good question. And unfortunately, we just don't know enough. And we just don't have enough groups studying different species. So interest is a part of that as well. You have to have people that want to study different species. Okay, so if anywhere in here I don't answer a question quite in the right direction that you're looking for, if that asks that leads to more questions that you have, just shoot me an email and I'm happy to clarify. Okay, so Lauren asked a question about technology, and she talks about, EEG was invented, and that's how we know about, sleep patterns. And so she's asking us, without the discovery of new technology, would we just make basic assumptions off our common knowledge on sleep? And then how can we gain new insight on dreaming and sleeping if technology is not advanced? Honestly, the reason why we know the amount about sleep that we know is due to technology. I don't have an answer for that other than simply making very stringent observations of people while they sleep, like literally watching them sleep and writing down what they do. That is extremely limited. Our ability to be able to state what cycle, what stage of sleep you're in and how you're going through the cycles can only be measured by EEG. We need a combination of the brain waves. We need the breathing. We need to know in the muscle reaction, how lax the muscle is. Those things tell us what stage you're in. And without a technology to measure that, there is no way for us to tell. Like, you may have a Fitbit, for example, to where that tells you, how you're sleeping. That cannot tell you what stages you're in, and that's a piece of technology. We need the brain waves and the muscles to be able to measuring the muscles to tell us what stage you're in. So the short answer to your question is if we didn't have technology, then we really wouldn't know a whole lot about sleep. The only way to learn more about sleep is to further advance that technology. Being able to do things like using EEG and fMRI together, being able to make that better than what it is, because it's not great, to be able to use those things together and also to look at like a molecular level. We could advance technology to do that, then we could actually learn a whole lot about sleep. But really, we are limited by our technology, and I don't really know any other way to be able to learn more than what we currently know without furthering the technology. So good question. Unfortunately, I wish I had a better answer. I wish I had a different answer, but that is the truth. You need better technology to be able to learn more about sleep, at least. Okay, so Tyler asked about, and I always get this question. I always find it funny. So he's asking about the historical way that humans used to sleep. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, people used to sleep in segments. So they would, go to bed at maybe sunset and then sleep for maybe 3 or 4 hours and then wake up for an hour or two and then go back to sleep for another 3 or 4 hours. So humans were still sleeping 7 to 8 hours per night, but they were sleeping it in two different chunks. So he's asking my opinion, I'm assuming, how do I believe the best way for humans to sleep? What is the best way? And should we go back to the original way that humans used to sleep, or continue to do what we've been doing now, which is we refer to as continuous sleep? And I always get this question at this time, and I always hesitate to answer it because this is actually your discussion forum question. I'm asking you guys what you think. So I don't want to bias any answers by giving my opinion on how you should sleep for this question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until the forum is closed, the discussion forum is closed, and then on a post I'm going to actually clarify and state, answer this question basically. But the very, very kind of tidbit answer I can provide is that what we're finding today, and I think that the sleep field is really going to go in this direction more so. We try to generalize people as much as possible, but as we talked about in the previous, in one of the first questions, generalizing is kind of bad sometimes. Everybody's an individual. And as much as we try to average people together, honestly, sometimes we have to really look at individual patterns. And so for one person, I might say they should do segmented sleep. For somebody else, it may not be the right thing to do. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at, I think that we should look at this on an individual basis, but I will give my general opinion on like the whole public later when the forum is closed. So that way that I don't bias anybody into thinking one thing over another because I said it. So very good question. I always get that question, but I'm going to just wait on that for giving it a proper answer. Okay, so Shauna asked about the kinds of the lecture about sleeping animals. She remarked that she was surprised that, or had no idea that we hadn't studied it in basically everything. And that's a very common thought that we've kind of figured it all out, but we really haven't. And she asks about rats and death through sleep deprivation. So in the lecture, I talk about how when studying rats with a very specific kind of technique called disc over water, when you deprive particularly rats with this particular technique, it results in death, and it results in a very particular pattern of symptoms like fur loss and temperature change in the rat and things like that. And we only see this in rats. It's been done with pigeons, and it's not shown to have the same effect in pigeons. And also, it's you can deprive rats with other techniques and not get this same sort of death sentence, as well as the same pattern of behavior and physiological symptoms. So she asks, do other animals experience microsleeps, which we found in humans? And the question is it that the rats don't experience microsleeps, and could that be contributing to the death of this particular technique? So to answer that question, there is evidence that rats do experience microsleeps. There have been studies that have shown that when a rat in particular is experiencing sleep deprivation, there are certain areas of the brain that demonstrate brain activity that looks like they're sleeping. So they're awake, they're alert, but there are particular areas of the brain that look dormant or look like they're actually entering a stage of sleep. So there is argument that rats experience microsleeps. So that doesn't explain why they are susceptible to death with this particular technique. What's very likely is there's just something about the rats and this particular technique that stresses them out to that point. There isn't a super great answer as to why that particular species is the only one that gets this, the only one that's been studied that gets this particular death sentence from the Discover Water technique. I don't have a really good answer as to why the rat does this. It's been studied over and over, but they don't really get why it affects them this particular way. It's likely to do something with a stress response, and this particular animal. So unfortunately, I don't have a super good answer, but I can answer in the fact that I do believe that microsleeps are not related, in the sense that it's not the reason why they don't do well with this technique in sleep deprivation. So Shauna also asked another question about dolphins swimming in a clockwise formation. So the paper that I assigned for this, this is a really good paper, and it actually answers your question pretty clearly. So I would encourage you to go ahead and open that paper up. And I do have the paper here just to remind you guys that it is this one right here. This is the Staffney paper, Staffney and Manger. And if you go all the way down, if you do want to skip ahead, I mean, it's a relatively easy paper to understand, the general idea. And if you actually just go all the way down to the conclusions, starting on the discussion, so section 4, this is page 922. It very clearly talks about how it's not necessarily a hemisphere dominant. So like, if you're right-handed, then you're technically left hemisphere dominant sort of idea. So it's not explained by dominance. It's more hemisphere dominance is likely explained by something to do with the environment, whether it's the magnetic field or the Coriolis force or something like that. So go ahead and read that article, because I think you're gonna see that your question is answered in terms of swimming in which direction based on what hemisphere of the world you're in. For dolphins. So I'm going to let you sort of look into that and read that on your own, because it answers your question pretty nicely. Okay, so Sarah asked about the different stages of sleep that humans go through, the classified in cycles. And so she was asking, how many cycles of sleep does the average person go through a night? And then how many cycles of sleep should an average person go through a night? So this is actually very simple math, because each cycle is 90 minutes or an hour and a half. So if you think about, okay, so, 2 cycles would be 3 hours, and then 2 more would be 6 hours, and then 1 more would be 7.5. So that's, so 2 cycles would be 3 hours, and then that's 6 hours. And then 1 more cycle would be at 7.5 hours. So if you sleep 7.5 hours, technically by math, you go through 5 cycles. The more you sleep, the more cycles you go through. So this question actually depends on the age of the person. So if you are an adult between really 20 or early 20s to 50, we would say that you should get 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. If you're an adolescent, it's more. If you're a child, it's more. If you're an infant, it's more. And so depending on your age, the recommended number of hours of sleep that you should get changes. So it changes based on your age. Obviously, too, if you're sick, then you should get more sleep because it helps you heal. So how much does an average person go through a night? I would say 5 cycles. How much do most people get actually? there's been a lot of debate as to how many hours of sleep the average person gets. And I'm gonna talk about this in the sense of an average adult. There have been studies looking at different age groups. College students, for example, are notoriously poor sleepers, experience a lot of sleep deprivation and less sleep. We call them short sleepers. So, an average college student might get 5 hours of sleep. So all you have to do is think about that in terms of how many, 90-minute cycles are in that period. So I would say that, an average person might get 6 hours of sleep. So they're getting they're going through 4 cycles. Obviously, you want to sleep to the point where you feel rested and you don't want to oversleep. So what's right for you will depend on a lot of different things, actually depending on genetics. It depends on your environment, things like that, in terms of how much sleep you actually need. And it also depends on your time in, what's going on with your life right now in terms of stress, in terms of illness, things like that. So I would say that, depending on how many hours of sleep you get, that's going to be how many cycles you generally get. In a normal situation, assuming that you're healthy and you're not experiencing any sort of sleep disorder or anything like that. Okay, so Courtney, this is the last question. The introduction video mentioned that using only 10% of our brains is a myth, and that we actually use all of our brain all of the time, even during sleep. So that is true. So her question is, are we constantly using the full percentage of our brain all the time, or do we just have the ability to use all parts at different points in time? So this is a good question, because this is something that's kind of hard to conceptualize if you haven't taken a lot of neuroanatomy courses. So the brain is sort of always on go, right? But we do use portions of the brain more than others. So everyone always thinks about, well, it's important that we're using this part or this part or this part. But what's equally important is that we're not using another part. So, turning on the prefrontal cortex thinking side, but turning down the emotion, let's say the amygdala, that combination of turning one up and turning one down is important. So we are using, so think of it like, yes, we are using our brain all the time. All the parts are doing different things. So if a particular area of the brain is not being stimulated the same way as another part of the brain, that's just as important. So we're not necessarily using it in the sense that there it'll light up in terms of activation, but it's still important that particular area of the brain is not being activated. So it's kind of a weird concept. We have these neurotransmitters, these chemicals in our brain that's turning things on and also quieting other things. And so that period, you have to ask yourself, is the quieting of this particular brain area the same thing as using it? Or is it, kind of lying dormant for a period of time while another area of the brain is being triggered and being actively activated? So yes, things are going on all the time, but at the same time, we're not everything is at full go all the time. In fact, if you have too much activity going on, that's when you experience a seizure. So seizure is overactivation of parts of the brain. And so you want parts of the brain to be quiet while other ones are being loud. Another way to think about this is during sleep, for example, there are parts of the brain that are normally active in sleep that might normally be more dormant during your awake time, okay? Or it serves a different purpose or moves in a different order, okay? So your neurotransmitters go through a particular path when you're awake. Maybe it reverses that path when you're asleep in that particular area of the brain. So all the the parts are still there and they're still working, but it might be working in a different order, or it might be working in a different path, or have a different job given the state that you're in terms of your active state of awareness. Okay, so if you're asleep, those particular areas of the brain might be working differently than when you're awake. So those parts of the brain are still working, and they're still working in unison, still working together. And one might be active and one might be dormant, and then they might switch places. But the fact that they're doing these different things is important. The fact that they're doing them at the same time is very important. So the short answer to your question is yes, we do use all of our brain, but it's not all go all the time, every second. Okay, you're going to always use parts of the brain more at given times than others. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so if you guys have any more questions, if this spurred any more questions, if you're confused about anything, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer them. With these videos, I just go until the question's answered, all the questions are answered. If there's a week where you don't have any questions, then I won't do a live lecture. So if there's one question, I'll be on here for however long it takes me to answer that question. So hopefully this answered everything. If you guys have any additional questions, you can email me. I will post this video as soon as I can, hopefully the night that I've done it, so that way everybody can kind of click on it and take a look. So have a great rest of your night, and I will see you next time.